Daniel Thompson, the CEO of a well-known pizza chain, had always prided himself on staying connected to the inner workings of his business, but lately, he felt increasingly distanced from the day-to-day struggles his employees faced. To bridge that gap, he decided to go undercover, ordering a pizza under an alias to experience firsthand the customer service his delivery team provided. His plan was simple: place an order, track the delivery process, and observe how the staff handled the pressures of the job. It was supposed to be a routine experience, one that would give him insight into the small but important moments that shaped his business. That evening, as Daniel waited eagerly by his door for the delivery, he felt a mix of curiosity and anticipation. The doorbell rang, and he opened it to find Johnny Clark, a young delivery boy who appeared to be no older than 18. At first, Daniel's thoughts were focused on the pizza, but the moment his eyes met Johnny's, something felt off. Johnny stood there, trembling, his eyes red-rimmed and swollen as if he had been crying. For a split second, Daniel was unsure whether he was seeing things clearly. The tears weren't just a trickle, they were flowing, uncontrollable, spilling down Johnny's cheeks as he held the pizza box in his hands. The sight caught Daniel completely off guard. He had expected to receive a simple pizza, not to witness a moment of raw emotion from one of his employees. "Hey, are you okay?" Daniel asked, his voice soft, instinctively trying to comfort the young man. Johnny didn't respond immediately, he simply held out the pizza, his hands shaking. The tears kept flowing, and Daniel found himself at a loss for words. It was clear that Johnny was overwhelmed, but Daniel couldn't tell why. The young delivery boy managed a broken smile, but it was so fragile that it barely seemed real. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, trying to steady himself, but the tears kept coming. I'm sorry," Johnny stammered, his voice cracking with emotion. "I didn't mean to." He paused, taking a shaky breath, his shoulders trembling as though the weight of something far heavier than a pizza was bearing down on him. Daniel was struck by the vulnerability in Johnny's voice, but at the same time, he was unsure how to respond. He had expected a simple transaction: pay, thank, and go, but this moment felt different. It was as though he was standing in the middle of something much deeper, something personal and painful, that he wasn't prepared for. "You don't have to apologize," Daniel said, taking the pizza from Johnny's hands, feeling an overwhelming surge of compassion for the young man in front of him. "What's going on? You don't have to tell me, but if you need someone to listen, I'm here." Johnny's eyes met his, and for a moment, there was silence between them. The world outside seemed to fade away as Daniel stood there, waiting. Then, slowly, Johnny spoke. "It's just been a really rough day. A rough week. My mom, she's sick. She's been in and out of the hospital for the last few months, and I'm just trying to keep it all together." His voice quivered with each word, and Daniel could see the weight of his words pressing on him. "I was supposed to close tonight, but they made me stay late because the shift was short. I just can't seem to do enough, you know." Johnny's words tumbled out in a rushed, incoherent stream, and Daniel's heart broke with each sentence. The weight of the young man's struggles was impossible to ignore, and in that moment, Daniel felt a deep sense of guilt for not having seen this coming. As the CEO of a large company, he had been so focused on profits, customer satisfaction, and operational efficiency that he had overlooked the personal battles his employees were fighting every day. Johnny wasn't just a delivery boy, he was a young man trying to balance work, family, and life, all while carrying the invisible burden of stress and worry. Daniel stood there, stunned by the raw honesty of the moment. he realized that Johnny's tears weren't just about the pressures of the job, they were a reflection of the overwhelming emotional weight that came with trying to be everything for everyone. "I didn't mean to lose it," Johnny whispered, wiping his eyes with the sleeve of his jacket. I don't know how much longer I can keep going like this." Daniel felt a lump form in his throat, the urge to reach out and offer more than just kind words. He wanted to do something, anything, to help ease Johnny's pain. But all he could do was stand there, listening, understanding the gravity of the situation, and knowing that it wasn't enough to simply be a bystander. As Johnny turned to leave, Daniel's mind raced with thoughts of how he could make things right, how he could better support his employees, and how he could ensure that no one else was silently suffering like Johnny. This moment had been a wake-up call. It wasn't just about customer service, it was about human service. Daniel realized that he had to shift his focus. His responsibility didn't end with the customers, it extended to his employees, who were carrying burdens far heavier than a pizza order. He made a silent vow to himself that he would do more to support them, to listen, and to make sure they knew they didn't have to shoulder their struggles alone. As Johnny walked away, still wiping his tears, Daniel felt a deep sense of gratitude for the courage it took for Johnny to share his pain, and for the chance he had been given to understand, truly understand, the people who made his company run. Johnny stood at the doorstep, his face flushed with embarrassment as he awkwardly wiped at his eyes, trying to hide the tears that had been flowing uncontrollably. The pizza he had delivered sat untouched in Daniel's hands, and the weight of the moment was far heavier than any delivery he had ever made. His body trembled slightly, his breath uneven, as he stammered out an apology, his voice cracking with the effort to regain some semblance of composure. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "I'm fine," Johnny muttered, but his words were hollow, unable to disguise the depth of his distress. Daniel stood frozen, his concern deepening with every passing second. He had never seen the young delivery boy so vulnerable, so far removed from the easygoing, almost cheerful persona he usually wore. Johnny's tears weren't just a response to a bad day, they were the raw, visible expression of months of bottled-up pain. Something was terribly wrong, and Daniel could see that Johnny was struggling to keep himself together. The tears came in waves, and Johnny couldn't seem to stop them no matter how hard he tried. His hands gripped the edge of the pizza bag, but even that couldn't steady him. Daniel knew something had to be done. This was no ordinary delivery, no casual exchange of money for food. Without thinking, Daniel stepped outside, his eyes never leaving Johnny's hunched figure, still standing awkwardly in front of him. "Hey," Daniel said softly, his voice a steady anchor in the midst of the chaos. "It's okay. You don't have to apologize." "What's going on, Johnny?" Johnny hesitated, his body stiff with uncertainty. His gaze flickered to the ground, unable to meet Daniel's eyes, as if he were ashamed of what had become of him in this moment. He opened his mouth as though to speak but then closed it again, unsure of where to start. After what felt like an eternity of silence, Johnny finally exhaled a shaky breath. I don't know how to do this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes darted around nervously, as if he was afraid someone might overhear, but the street was empty. "I've been working all these hours, trying to make ends meet for my family. I keep pushing myself, and it's still not enough. It feels like no matter how hard I try, nothing's getting better. My mom, she's been sick for months, and I can't afford the meds she needs. My little sister, she's still too young to understand why I'm always gone, always exhausted. And every night, I come home and wonder if this will be the night when everything falls apart." I feel like I'm drowning, and I'm just too tired to keep swimming, you know. Johnny's voice faltered as he spoke, each word coming with the weight of the invisible burden he had been carrying for far too long. Daniel stood there, listening carefully, letting Johnny's words hang in the air. He could feel the gravity of the situation pressing down on him. Johnny wasn't just delivering pizzas, he was delivering a piece of his broken self to the world, hoping someone would take notice. Daniel's heart ached with the realization that Johnny's tears weren't just about a difficult shift or an awkward mistake, they were the culmination of months of exhaustion, uncertainty, and the relentless stress of trying to keep his family afloat while carrying the weight of responsibilities that no young man should ever have to bear alone. Johnny's hands were trembling now, his whole body shaking from the intensity of his emotions. His breath came in ragged gasps, and for the first time, he let the full weight of his struggles pour out in a way he couldn't control. I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this, Johnny continued, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know if I'm even making a difference. It feels like I'm just spinning in place, and the harder I try, the worse everything gets. I'm scared, Daniel. I'm scared I won't be able to keep holding things together. The silence that followed was heavy, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Daniel's mind raced, his heart aching for the young man in front of him. He could see Johnny's vulnerability now, raw and unfiltered, and it was clear that the emotional weight he had been carrying was suffocating him. Daniel stepped forward, placing a hand gently on Johnny's shoulder, grounding him in a moment of connection. Johnny, Daniel said, his voice calm and steady, I don't know what you're going through, but I do know this: you don't have to do it alone. You're carrying so much right now, but you don't have to carry it by yourself. You've got people who care about you, people who see you, and you're not a burden to them. You don't have to shoulder everything in silence. It's okay to ask for help. It's okay to feel like this. You're doing the best you can, and that's all anyone can ask of you. Johnny looked up at him then, his eyes still clouded with tears, but something about Daniel's words seemed to break through the weight of his despair. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to hope, even just a little. The pain of his struggles was still there, still heavy, but in that moment, Johnny realized he didn't have to carry it all by himself. The tears slowed, and though the path ahead remained uncertain, he felt a sense of relief, small, fragile, but real, that he wasn't alone anymore. Johnny's voice trembled as he began speaking, the words coming out slower than usual, heavy with a burden he had carried for far too long. Daniel stood there, caught off guard by the rawness in Johnny's tone, his heart beginning to ache with each passing word. At first, Johnny had been quiet, simply dropping off the delivery as part of his usual routine, but something had shifted in the air between them, an invisible weight that had prompted Johnny to speak, to open up about a life Daniel had never fully imagined. As the young man explained the long hours he worked, the low pay, and the constant fear of losing his job, Daniel felt as though he had been blindsided. The reality of Johnny's life wasn't just a matter of inconvenient shifts or a tough commute, it was the constant struggle to keep his family afloat in a world that seemed to get harder with every passing day. Johnny spoke of his mother's health, of the bills piling up faster than he could pay them, of the sleepless nights spent worrying about how to make ends meet. His voice cracked as he described how he barely saw his younger siblings, how the dream of being able to provide for them seemed so far out of reach. It's like you're working all the time, but you're not going anywhere. You're just stuck, Johnny confessed, his eyes staring blankly at the ground as though the weight of his words was too much to bear. The vulnerability in his voice was both a relief and a heartache for Daniel, a stranger to Johnny's world, yet now more connected to it than ever before. The young man's shoulders slumped as he continued, each admission adding another layer of rawness to the story. Johnny's struggle wasn't just financial, it was emotional, a battle between hope and despair that seemed to have no end. "I'm just trying to do right by them," Johnny said quietly, his gaze still locked on the floor, avoiding Daniel's eyes. "But no matter how hard I work, it's never enough. I'm tired, man. I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this." The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. For the first time, he realized how little he had ever truly understood about the lives of those who worked behind the scenes, those who didn't have the luxury of comfort or stability. Johnny's pain wasn't just about money, it was about a lifetime of sacrifices, of giving everything and yet never feeling like enough. The young man's raw honesty left Daniel speechless, unable to respond as the enormity of Johnny's struggles settled heavily between them. He had assumed that life was difficult for people in blue-collar jobs, but he had never truly understood the depths of that hardship, the emotional toll of constantly being pushed to the brink, of working oneself to exhaustion, only to face the looming reality of never being able to catch up. As Johnny spoke, Daniel's sense of guilt and empathy deepened. He had always taken his own privileges for granted: the steady job, the comfortable lifestyle, the security that came with a simple paycheck. But in this moment, standing face to face with Johnny, he began to understand that true hardship was not just about struggling to survive, but about constantly fighting to keep hope alive. He thought of his own life, his own challenges, and realized how small they seemed in comparison. Johnny's resilience, despite the odds stacked against him, began to leave an indelible mark on Daniel's heart. This was no longer just a conversation, it was an awakening, a moment of reckoning. He had heard of hardship, seen it on the news, but never had he felt its weight so personally. Johnny wasn't asking for sympathy or pity, he was simply sharing a truth that few ever had the courage to speak aloud. The weight of his family's expectations, the exhaustion that came with never being able to fully rest, the invisible shackles of low-wage labor. Daniel began to see it all through a new lens. Johnny's strength, his ability to carry on despite the mounting pressure, began to shine through the sadness in his eyes. Daniel felt a quiet admiration for him, not for his job or his position in life, but for his unwavering perseverance in the face of overwhelming adversity. The silence between them stretched on, the magnitude of Johnny's vulnerability hanging in the air like a heavy fog. Daniel found himself searching for words, any words, to express the deep well of empathy that had opened up within him, but none seemed adequate. All he could offer was a simple nod, a quiet acknowledgement of the pain Johnny had laid bare. In that moment, Daniel realized that hardship was not just about surviving, it was about enduring with dignity, about holding on to the belief that things could somehow get better, even when it felt impossible. Johnny's struggle was a reflection of a larger truth: the invisible people who kept the world running, the ones who carried the burdens of society on their shoulders with little recognition or reward. Daniel didn't know what the future held for Johnny or for himself, but in this brief exchange, he had been given a glimpse into a world of resilience and strength that would stay with him long after the conversation had ended. As Johnny stood up to leave, Daniel watched him walk away, his head slightly bowed under the weight of his responsibilities. For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt something deeper than sympathy. He felt a connection to the silent struggles of others, and a quiet resolve to do more than just look away. As Daniel sat quietly across from Johnny, listening to his story, something inside him began to shift. Johnny, a longtime employee of the company, had spoken in a way that was raw and unfiltered, recounting the struggles he faced daily, the financial strain, the stress of working long hours with little recognition, and the constant worry about making ends meet. Johnny's words were more than just complaints, they were an honest account of the difficulties that had begun to chip away at his spirit, making him feel invisible and unheard. As Johnny spoke, Daniel's mind raced, and he began to feel the weight of his position as CEO more acutely than ever before. He had always seen himself as a businessman, focused on profits, efficiency, and the bottom line, but this conversation was something different. It was a revelation. Johnny's struggles weren't isolated incidents. There had to be countless other employees who were dealing with similar burdens, silently shouldering them day after day, just to keep their jobs. The thought struck Daniel like a punch to the chest. He had always assumed that if his employees were doing their jobs and earning a paycheck, they were fine. He had taken for granted the idea that financial compensation was enough, that as long as they were paid, the other aspects of their well-being, emotional, mental, and personal, didn't require his attention. But as Johnny continued to speak, Daniel began to realize the enormity of his oversight. These employees weren't just numbers on a balance sheet or faces on a payroll. They were people, each with their own set of challenges, fears, and dreams. Johnny's voice cracked when he spoke about how he had worked late nights, skipped meals, and barely seen his family, all while putting in more hours than his contract required, just to stay afloat. The toll it had taken on his health, his relationships, and his peace of mind was clear. And yet, despite all of this, Johnny had never felt like his sacrifices had been noticed. No one had ever taken the time to ask how he was really doing or to show any recognition for the hard work he put in. Daniel felt his stomach turn at the thought. He had been so focused on financial metrics, on growth and expansion, that he had missed the human element of his business. He had failed to create an environment where his employees felt seen, valued, or supported. This moment, this conversation, forced him to confront a painful truth: the company he had built was built on the backs of people who felt like they didn't matter. They were simply tools in a machine, working tirelessly without ever being given the respect or acknowledgement they deserved. As Daniel absorbed this new understanding, he began to question how many others in his company were suffering in silence, too afraid or too exhausted to speak up. How many of them, like Johnny, had been so worn down by the daily grind that they had given up hope of ever being heard. The weight of this realization settled over him, and for the first time, Daniel truly understood what it meant to lead. It wasn't just about numbers. It wasn't about pushing for results at any cost. It was about creating a space where people could thrive, where they could find fulfillment and balance, and where their contributions were celebrated. He felt a profound sense of responsibility to do better by his employees, to recognize them as more than just workers, but as people with lives and struggles that deserved compassion. Daniel realized that no amount of financial compensation could replace the human need for validation, for respect, for acknowledgement. Employees needed to feel seen, heard, and appreciated, not just in the form of a paycheck, but through the culture of the company itself. The realization hit Daniel hard, but it also sparked something deep within him. This wasn't just about Johnny or his specific situation. It was about creating a shift in the company, a cultural transformation that would permeate every level, from the executives to the frontline workers. He couldn't change the past, but he could change the future. This moment, though humbling, became a catalyst for his vision of a more empathetic and human-centered company. He knew that he had to be the one to lead that change. The first step would be to truly listen to his employees, to understand their needs, and to find ways to support them, not just financially, but emotionally and mentally as well. He understood now that leadership wasn't about power or control. It was about stewardship and responsibility, taking care of the people who helped build the company, ensuring that they were given the tools they needed to succeed both at work and in their personal lives. As Johnny finished speaking, Daniel's heart felt heavy but also filled with a new sense of purpose. He looked at Johnny, and for the first time, he saw not just an employee, but a person who deserved more than just a paycheck, but respect, dignity, and the recognition of his hard work. He felt deeply moved by the conversation, and a quiet resolve began to take root within him. Something had to change, and it started with him. Daniel knew it wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be a quick fix. But in that moment, he made a promise to himself and to his employees that he would do better. He would create a company that valued its people, that nurtured their growth, and that treated them with the dignity they deserved. He would lead with empathy and make sure that every employee felt seen and appreciated. It was a profound shift, and Daniel knew that, for the sake of his company and the people who made it run, there was no turning back. Johnny's voice shook as he spoke, the words tumbling out in a raw torrent, his emotions too heavy to hold back any longer. Standing in Daniel's office, he had tried to maintain control, to hold on to some semblance of dignity, but the weight of his struggles, the long hours, the exhaustion, the fear of being unseen had finally broken through. He wasn't just talking about a bad day at work, he was speaking about a lifetime of feeling unheard, of giving his all without ever feeling like it mattered. Daniel could see the anguish in Johnny's eyes, the weariness that seemed to seep from his very bones, and it moved him in a way that words couldn't quite express. Without hesitation, he invited Johnny into his home. As the two of them sat across from each other in Daniel's living room, Daniel poured Johnny a drink and gestured for him to take a seat. The atmosphere was quieter, less charged than the office, and the moment felt like a chance for both of them to breathe. The tension that had clung to Johnny's shoulders seemed to ease just a little as he sat down, but his eyes never left the floor, still carrying the burden of everything he had been holding in. Daniel listened intently as Johnny opened up more, his words now coming in slow, measured tones, but the pain was still there, palpable in every syllable. Johnny spoke about the long days spent in a job that drained him, the constant pressure to meet impossible expectations, and the isolation that came with it. He talked about the nights when he lay awake, wondering if he was truly making any difference, or if he was just another cog in a machine that didn't care about him. The more Johnny shared, the more Daniel began to understand just how deep the problem ran. Johnny wasn't just struggling with his work, he was struggling with a system that had ignored his needs for far too long, a system that had failed to see him as a person and not just an employee. As Daniel listened, he couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. He had always prided himself on being a good boss, someone who cared about his team, but as Johnny's story unfolded, Daniel realized just how much he had missed, how much he had taken for granted. It wasn't enough to provide a paycheck or a place to work, the people who worked for him needed more than that. They needed understanding, support, and a system that recognized their humanity. Johnny's story was one of silent endurance, of quiet sacrifices that had gone unnoticed. Daniel's heart ached as he watched the toll it had taken on Johnny, on his spirit, his sense of self, and his outlook on life. The weight of responsibility settled on Daniel's shoulders, heavier than he expected. But as Johnny finished speaking, Daniel knew one thing for certain: he couldn't let things continue the way they were. "Johnny," Daniel said, his voice steady but filled with compassion, "I hear you. I really do. And I want you to know that what you've just shared with me matters. Your story matters. And I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure this changes." Johnny looked up at him, his eyes wide, but the exhaustion still weighed heavy on his face. He didn't seem to fully understand what Daniel meant, but there was a flicker of hope in his gaze, a glimmer of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Daniel continued, his voice unwavering. I'm going to take real steps to improve the working conditions here. You and the others like you, the ones who are always doing their best but never getting the support they need, will no longer be overlooked. We're going to look at the hours, the expectations, the resources. We're going to make sure you have the tools you need to succeed, not just the pressure to keep pushing forward. This isn't just about making sure you do your job, it's about making sure you're okay, that you're seen, and that you're supported. Johnny's throat tightened as he tried to process Daniel's words. He felt a wave of gratitude wash over him, but it was mixed with disbelief. Could it really be possible? Could the very thing he had been yearning for, understanding, support, real change, finally be on the horizon? He had spent so long feeling invisible, fighting against an unrelenting tide that seemed to drag him under, and now here was Daniel, the very person who held the power to change it all, making a promise. A promise that things would be different. "Thank you," Johnny whispered, his voice thick with emotion, the words barely escaping his lips. He wasn't sure how to fully express what he was feeling, how to convey the enormity of his gratitude for being heard, for being seen. He felt as though a heavy weight had been lifted, but he also knew that change would take time, that there was still a long road ahead. But for the first time in a long time, Johnny allowed himself to believe that change was possible. That his struggles hadn't been in vain. Daniel smiled, a quiet but genuine smile, and nodded. "No, thank you, Johnny. For trusting me with your story. And for giving me the chance to make it right." As Johnny left Daniel's home that evening, his mind was a whirlwind of emotions: gratitude, hope, and still, a sense of uncertainty. But more than anything, he felt lighter, like the burden of years of frustration had begun to lift, just a little. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like someone had his back. And that made all the difference. Johnny had been on edge all evening, his nerves frayed from the stress of a long shift as a pizza delivery driver. It wasn't just the grueling hours or the endless miles on the road, it was the feeling of being invisible, unheard, and unappreciated by the company he worked for. The management's lack of communication, the low pay, and the constant pressure to deliver more in less time had worn him down. His frustration had reached a boiling point as he walked into the quiet pizza shop one evening after another grueling delivery. As he passed through the door, ready to vent his anger to anyone who would listen, he didn't expect the encounter that would change everything. Standing behind the counter was a man he didn't recognize. He was dressed in casual clothes, but there was something about him that exuded authority, a presence that commanded attention. Johnny, worn out and irritable, had begun his usual routine of ranting to the shift manager about the unreasonable expectations placed on the drivers, about the lack of support from corporate, about how the delivery system was falling apart. It wasn't the first time he'd complained, but tonight it felt different. He was ready for a confrontation, ready to make his feelings known, as he always did, in the hopes that maybe, just maybe, someone would listen. But the man standing across from him wasn't just any customer or casual observer. He was Daniel, the CEO of the entire pizza chain. Johnny didn't realize who he was at first, and he continued to vent his frustrations with a raw, unfiltered honesty, unaware that the person listening to him had the power to change everything. When he finished, there was a long pause. Daniel didn't react immediately, he simply studied Johnny with a steady gaze, as though weighing the gravity of what he had just heard. Johnny, still oblivious, looked around for a moment, waiting for some kind of response. It wasn't until Daniel finally spoke that Johnny realized the enormity of the situation. "Johnny," Daniel said, his voice calm but firm, "I've been listening to everything you've said. and I think it's time I introduce myself properly. I'm not just a customer here. I'm Daniel, the CEO of this company." Johnny froze, his mind struggling to process the words that had just been spoken. He blinked in disbelief, unable to fully comprehend what he was hearing. The CEO? Here. Listening to him, a lowly delivery driver, complain about conditions. It seemed impossible. The disbelief in Johnny's eyes was evident. You're the CEO." Johnny stammered, still unsure whether he was being pranked. Daniel nodded, giving a small, understanding smile. "Yes, I am. And I've heard enough." There was no hint of anger, no sign of defensiveness in Daniel's voice. Instead, he spoke with a quiet empathy, a sincerity that struck Johnny in a way he hadn't expected. "You're not wrong, Johnny. And I've been hearing a lot of these same concerns from drivers and staff across the company. It's clear that something has to change. And I'm not here to just listen. I'm here to make sure that things do change, starting with you." Johnny's mind was racing, his emotions a mix of shock, confusion, and something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. No one in the company had ever spoken to him with this kind of respect or concern. No one had ever acknowledged the struggles he and his co-workers faced daily. Daniel's words didn't just feel like a hollow promise, they felt like a genuine commitment, a promise that things would be different. "I know the way things have been going," Daniel continued. "And I'm sorry for what you've had to deal with. The working conditions for our delivery drivers, the lack of support, the long hours, the unrealistic expectations, all of it has gone on for too long. It's not just about your situation, Johnny. It's about all of our employees, from the drivers to the kitchen staff to the front-end workers. You deserve more than this." Johnny stood there, struggling to find words, his heart beating faster as the weight of Daniel's words sank in. Was this real? Was the CEO really standing here, genuinely concerned about his well-being? Daniel took a deep breath, his face serious. "Starting today, I'm making it my mission to change the way this company treats its employees. I will be implementing a company-wide review of our policies, focusing on improving working conditions for everyone. We'll be offering better pay, improving communication between staff and management, and ensuring that our employees have the support they need to thrive, both in their jobs and in their personal lives." Johnny's eyes welled with tears, a mixture of disbelief and gratitude flooding through him. For so long, he had felt like just another cog in the machine, invisible and replaceable. But here was the CEO of a major company, standing before him, acknowledging his struggles and vowing to make real, lasting changes. "I didn't expect this," Johnny murmured, his voice shaky. "I never thought someone in your position would care about what we go through." Daniel smiled softly, his gaze steady and kind. "You matter. All of you do. The people who make this company run, our drivers, our staff, our kitchen employees, are the heart of this business. And if we're going to succeed, we need to make sure you're supported, heard, and treated with respect. That starts now." As Johnny stood there, a sense of relief washed over him. For the first time in a long while, he felt like someone had actually heard him. And not just heard him, but had taken steps to make things better, not just for him, but for everyone like him. The realization that change was not only possible but already in motion was overwhelming. Daniel's promise was more than just words, it was a commitment to a future where employees were valued, supported, and given the tools to succeed. Johnny had never expected such a conversation, but in that moment, he knew that things were finally beginning to change. and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that things could get better. In the weeks that followed Daniel's decision to overhaul the company's policies, a palpable shift began to take place, one that seemed to touch every corner of the organization. Daniel had always been a man of action, and now, with the weight of his new commitments on his shoulders, he wasted no time in turning his vision into reality. He worked tirelessly with management to implement a series of changes that would not only elevate the company's operations but, more importantly, rebuild the trust and respect between employees and upper management. The first of these changes was a significant wage increase for delivery drivers, many of whom had long felt that their hard work went unnoticed and unrewarded. For years, they had been scraping by on wages that barely covered their basic needs, working long hours, often without the recognition they deserved. But Daniel knew that to truly make a difference, this had to be addressed. The increase was just the beginning. Alongside better wages, Daniel introduced a range of benefits, including paid sick leave, a perk that had previously been unavailable to many. These small but significant steps created an immediate ripple effect, and employees began to feel like the company truly cared about their well-being. The changes, though practical, were a clear indication that Daniel was not just talking about change, he was actively working to create it. But Daniel knew that financial adjustments and benefits alone wouldn't be enough. The real transformation would require a shift in the company's culture, and for that, open communication was key. So, he initiated a company-wide program aimed at improving communication between employees and upper management. It was a bold move, but Daniel was determined. He established regular town hall meetings, forums where employees could voice their concerns directly to management, ensuring that their voices would no longer be ignored. The program was designed to be as transparent as possible, with management expected to not only listen but respond to the feedback given. It was a momentous shift for a company that had long been known for its top-down structure, where feedback from employees had been discouraged or outright dismissed. Johnny, who had once felt trapped in a system that didn't seem to care about his struggles, found himself at the heart of this transformation. Initially skeptical, he soon began to see the tangible benefits of the changes. The wage increase gave him the financial stability he had long needed, and the new benefits provided him with a sense of security he hadn't felt in years. But it was the open lines of communication that truly changed his outlook. Johnny, once hesitant to speak up, now felt emboldened. He had been a quiet observer for so long, watching as others struggled in silence, but now, with his newfound sense of confidence, he felt compelled to become a voice for change within the company. He started speaking out at meetings, offering suggestions for improving the workplace, and even encouraging his colleagues to share their thoughts. His once muted presence in the company now had weight. His ideas were heard, his feedback valued, and his contributions acknowledged. This was a far cry from the days when he felt invisible, a mere cog in a machine that had little regard for his well-being. As Johnny continued to speak up, he saw that his optimism was contagious. His colleagues, who had once been demoralized and exhausted, began to show signs of hope. They started to realize that the company wasn't indifferent to their struggles, it was finally listening, finally responding. Johnny had seen firsthand how quickly things could change when management truly cared about the people who made the business run, and he now had a role in ensuring that change was sustainable. His confidence grew with each small victory, and he felt proud to be part of an organization that was evolving before his eyes. The company-wide transformation was not without its challenges. Some employees were slow to trust the changes, and there were occasional setbacks in the implementation process. However, the underlying message was clear: the company was making an effort, and that effort was being recognized. The wage increases were just the beginning, but they symbolized a larger commitment to the employees. The company was no longer just a place of work, but a community where people mattered. As the weeks turned into months, the transformation continued to unfold. Employees began to feel more connected to one another, their morale lifted by the tangible improvements they had experienced. The communication between employees and management became more open and honest, and the company as a whole started to operate with a new sense of purpose. For Johnny, the changes were life-altering. He had gone from feeling undervalued and overlooked to becoming a driving force behind the positive changes in the company. No longer silent, he was now part of a movement that was reshaping the workplace for the better. As he looked around at his colleagues, he saw a group of people who had once felt disconnected, now united in their shared commitment to building a better workplace. He felt proud of how far they had come, knowing that they had created a culture where everyone was valued no matter their role. The company was no longer a place where employees felt like mere workers, but a place where they felt seen, heard, and respected. And while there was still much work to be done, the transformation was undeniable. Johnny had become a symbol of hope for the rest of the employees, a reminder that change was possible, and that when they worked together, they could build a workplace that truly reflected the values of respect, trust, and collaboration. It was a new beginning, one where Johnny felt empowered and optimistic about the future, knowing that the company he worked for was finally becoming the kind of place he had always hoped it would be.